Oops. Nice lolly stick. Because I was eating a nice lolly. In history, there are many people who could claim the title of a violent and oppressive dictator. Figures such as Stalin, Mao, and Hitler set about taking millions of lives for their own personal gain. Yet smaller figures like Cromwell, Leopold II, and Mary I often go under the radar and just simply aren't spoken about that much. But there was a figure who is semi-well known and even to this day is incredibly divisive. Whilst some label her a heroine who stopped the oppressive powers trying to claim her kingdom, others call her a vile monster in the same vein as Emperor Diocletian. This is part 1 of the story of Ranavalona I, the Mad Queen of Madagascar. Now, sadly, Raid Shadow Legends still hasn't got in touch, but the best way to support me right now is to like, subscribe, share, and tap that little bell icon below so that you get notified whenever I upload. Other ways to support me include buying my book on Amazon, grabbing some of my merch if you want to feel my moustache against your skin, but not in that way, it's a fabric version, you weirdo. And you can also get access to these videos 48 hours early via Patreon for just £1. I don't know if my content is worth £1, but that's up to you. Being the 4th largest island in the world, Madagascar has had new archaeological evidence to show that it has had human habitation since at least 10,000 years ago. The main evidence from this comes from scratch marks on bones where there was most likely tools used to separate the meat from the bone. The modern populations of Madagascar would begin to arrive on the island around 500 CE, heralding from Africa and Indonesia. The largest ethnic group on Madagascar would be the Merina people, who can trace their ancestry back to Indonesia. Before the arrival of Europeans, the traditional Malagasy religion worshipped the creator Zanahari. This may seem like a random fact, but this is actually key to the story. Ranavalona I was born Romavo, somewhere between 1788 and 1790, although the exact date is currently unknown. Romavo was born in the Merina Kingdom, which was the largest of kingdoms and other various states on the island at the time. The childhood of Romavo is practically unknown, with stories and tales filling in the gaps. The one I saw the most whilst doing research was that she was born into poverty and was unable to read or write. Alternatively, she was born into minor royalty to the cousin of Prince... I'm not even going to try and pronounce that name because I will offend the entire population of Madagascar. One thing, however, is for certain: her father stopped an assassination attempt on the aforementioned prince. Once the prince ascended to the throne, he would adopt Romavo and betroth her to his son, who would become Rodama I. This was seen as a great honour for Romavo's family, even if it is a bit... What are you doing, step bro? That's going to get clipped, isn't it? Personally, I really hope it's the first story that's true, because the second one does make it sound like Romavo was living in a bit of a sweet home. In 1810, the young prince would find himself sitting on the Merina throne. Romavo, however, didn't immediately become the queen. She did, however, get a fancy name change, Ranavalona, a name that would come to bring terror to so many people. Ranavalona had to spend her days competing with Rodama's 11 other wives for his affection. However, it does appear she wasn't exactly a fan of her husband / adoptive brother / possibly her cousin, if you believe the Habsburg version of events. From the beginning of the marriage, the young couple essentially despised each other, and this was antiquated by the fact that Ranavalona would never give birth to any royal heirs, which placed her in a risky position at court. Now, Radama was a modern king and sought to bring the Marina Kingdom into the 19th century, competing with the European powers. In 1820, he would secure a commercial treaty with the British Empire which would allow him to obtain military equipment as well as training for his growing professional army. Following this, King Radama I would make the logical progression and use his new modern army to expand the Marina Kingdom. By the end of his military campaigns, he would have secured nearly the entirety of the island, becoming recognised as the first King of Madagascar by the European powers. Once his position was secure, Radama moved to form a collaboration with the London Missionary Society, or LMS. They would open schools and raise literacy rates amongst the Malagasy population. However, they would also be allowed to preach to the locals and began converting the Malagasy population to Christianity. This infuriated the traditionalist sect of Radama's aristocracy, which some might call foreshadowing. Radama I would culminate his incredibly progressive rule by abolishing the slave trade on Madagascar. Now, things were looking up for the Malagasy people until the king finally overstepped his bounds. He issued an order for all young men in his army to keep their hair short. Now, I fully understand the logic behind this. Short hair is one less thing for the enemy to grab onto during combat. It's easier to maintain when on long campaigns, and overall just makes the army look more presentable. But the traditionalist women of the island saw this as a step too far. They claimed they had the ancestral right to braid the hair of their warrior men. This then led to a revolt which, unluckily for its leaders, Radama decided that with all the good he had done, it was time to make things perfectly balanced. He would order for the leaders of the revolt to be brutally slain and then have their remains fed to wild dogs. Now, the much-loved king began to get sick either from syphilis, liver cirrhosis, or poison. But I don't really buy the poison story because the ultra-traditionalists, Ranavalona, and the people who just revolted against him definitely, absolutely adored him. Even with all these friendly faces around him, the king would pass away in 1828, allegedly slitting his own throat because he could no longer deal with the pain of his affliction. Now, the rightful heir, as Radama had no children, was the eldest son of Radama's eldest sister, Rakatobe. Now, Rakatobe had been educated in England, which meant a lot of his views lined up with his uncle's, which terrified the traditionalists. Now, as a lucky strike for the traditionalists, any child that Ranavalona bore would take precedent over Rakatobe, even if there was a chance it wasn't actually Radama's. Although, to be fair, the fact that at this point he was very much unalive, that would have to be a very quick bait and switch. Just being like, oh yeah, he had one last sudden burst of energy and yeah, we cracked on. Yep. Now, understandably, Ranavalona felt that at this time she may be removed from the picture. So, instead, she went on the offensive. Occupying the royal palace with the aid of officers from her home village and the traditionalist sect of the aristocracy, she would proclaim herself Ranavalona I on the 1st of August, 1828. She did this because, according to her, her late husband, Radama I, had wished for her to take the throne after his passing. The following June, she underwent a double ascension. Publicly, she would be coronated in a stunning gown made by a French tailor. Secretly, however, she was anointed by the blood of a freshly slaughtered bull. This more traditional rite was a sign of things to come. Now, many rulers have had a coronation speech, and Ranavalona's was incredibly spicy. Never say she is only a feeble and ignorant woman. How can she rule such a vast empire? I will rule here in the good fortune of my people and the glory of my name. The ocean shall be the boundary of my realm, and I will not cede the thickness of one hair of my realm. By the time she had completed these ceremonies, Ranavalona had eliminated all risks to her reign. Her nephew was gored with a spear whilst his mother was starved to death, as Malagasy tradition states that you cannot spill the blood of a female member of the royal family. So as you can imagine, female members of the royal family had it much, much worse, as Ranavalona had to get creative in how she would take them out. In fact, according to biographer Keith Laidler, she removed thousands of potential threats to her rule. Now, some sources state that she immediately got to work undoing the reforms put in place by her late husband. On the 28th of November 1828, she would publicly denounce the previous Anglo-Marina Treaty of 1820. Come the 25th of March 1829, she had expelled the British diplomatic agent Robert Lyle. Things may have not actually been that clear-cut, however, as British diplomat and historian Mervyn Brown claimed that the first few months of her reign were just fluctuations between her more traditionalist views and her late husband's more progressive, pro-British stance. This can be confirmed by her somewhat good relation with the LMS at the beginning of her rule. They were still allowed to operate their schools, hold mass, and convert local populations to Christianity. I did find one brief mention that she may have been trading with the United States at this time, but I didn't find much about it, so take that information with a pinch of salt. Ranavalona would then begin to institute her own reforms by calling for the creation of the first Malagasy dictionary. Just dance, take the record because I can't see straight anymore. Keep it cool. What's the name of this club? I can't remember, but it's alright, alright. Just dance, wanna be okay. Just dance, the record, babe. Better than just dance. Now, Ranavalona wasn't an idiot, and as much as she was on that Sigma grind set of reject modernity, embrace tradition, she knew that she needed some kind of infrastructure in place in order to keep up with the major players on the world stage. The expat artisans of the LMS, for example, were allowed to set up workshops to manufacture things like soap, hydraulic machinery, and gunpowder. The capital city of Antananarivo would see this gunpowder used in October of 1829. On the west of the island, the Saklava people would rebel against the Queen's rule, whilst on the east of the island, a French invasion would make landfall. You see, the French colony of Reunion relied on the cheap labour that it imported from Madagascar, which Queen Ranavalona I had put a stop to earlier that year. The French utilised another revolt, that of the Betsimisara people on the east of the island, as a pretense for the invasion. King Charles X of France would order attacks on the port towns of Toamasina and Ranavalona. However, as is normally the case for invading armies in more tropical environments, they were quickly overcome with disease. In this case, malaria ran rampant through the troops, and heavy resistance from the Malagasy army made it almost impossible for the French to make any serious gains. The French king was shockingly overthrown in a revolution in 1830. His successor, Louis Philippe, wasn't really that interested in any expensive colonial ventures and quickly buckled to British pressure to call off the invasion. The French troops would withdraw from Madagascar exactly a year after they invaded, leaving Ranavalona with a great victory under her belt. The French troops, who didn't survive the war, found their heads placed on spikes all along the eastern beaches of the island. This was basically a kingdom-sized version of a stay-out-of-my-room sign. Even with a victory, wars are expensive ventures, so after the war, Ranavalona realised she would have to truly open up her country to foreign trade. She also realised that the European powers would curb stomp her and her kingdom if she didn't truly bring it forward into the 19th century. However, the obvious gap in capability between the Marina Kingdom and its counterparts was now compounded by the fact that due to the war, the export of cattle and rice to Reunion and Mauritius had stopped. This then caused the eastern portion of the island to struggle, as this trade was a major part of its economy. To make things worse, the Malagasy army was now running dangerously low on ammunition. Now Ranavalona quickly realised she could fix both these problems in one foul swoop. The product that was created in the eastern portion of the island could be traded or sold for hard foreign currency. This foreign currency could then be utilised and reinvested into the purchase of more firearms and, of course, ammunition. So the Queen was forced to develop her bureaucratic talents. With the stroke of a pen, her military officers became portal authorities with the power to regulate trade within their respective territories. It's incredibly clear that Ranavalona was a fan of the spiffing Brit and figured out an exploit for for her IRL Paradox Interactive game. Now, Marina kings of the past would command assemblies and would have given oral orders to their subordinates, but Ranavalona would give orders via the written word. This created a new web of civil servants along the eastern coast, whilst the portal authorities were tasked with finding foreign buyers for the Malagasy cattle and rice. They were also to push the prospective buyer into paying up in a more solid foreign currency or just directly in ammunition. Ranavalona I wanted to ensure that imports were severely limited, giving orders to her civil servants that only the most necessary trades were to be made, and if they were to be made, imports could only be traded for local goods. This system helped local businesses and workers by allowing them to make a living, which in turn helped to repair the Eastern Malagasy economy. This was an ingenious move and really helped the populace, fairly similar to how Caligula started his rule. She would then go on to revolutionise how government officials communicated in the Marina Kingdom, creating a two-way communication system. Ranavalona would also have people keeping tabs on the level of local goods and imports at all times. The Queen had successfully managed to centralise the data coming in from these trades and would then go on to process it herself. This meant that she was accurately able to give and change the maximum quotas for imports coming into Madagascar. However, by now you could probably tell that Ranavalona was incredibly hands-on. In other words, she was a little bit authoritarian. Now, authoritarianism is incredibly corruptible, so Ranavalona needed to ensure that her portal authorities didn't just start taking bribes to bring in more imported goods or sell Malagasy goods at a lower price. Most of all, she didn't want anyone issuing decrees when she wasn't around and that she had no control over. So to ensure that no one took advantage of the sheer distances that this centralised system had to communicate over, she issued a warning. "I have the sole authority to make law. Through my words, if you attempt to speak in my name, your words will return to me like a bird of great destruction. You will be tried and punished." However, if she wasn't in such a chatty mood, you would receive the far more short and sweet version. "Though I am far away, I stand like a sentinel over you." Now, once she had brought the East Coast out of its post-war decline, Ranavalona's relationship with the LMS and the broader British community began to go south. Her first real moves were against the Christians on the island, banning sacraments in November of 1831. Next, Ranavalona ensured that no more Malagasy could be converted legally to Christianity. Those who had already converted could no longer take part in Holy Communion. Next, she had her governors crack down on the Christian schools, literally going into classrooms and taking young boys, some as young as 13, and enlisting them into the army. Now, this probably wasn't actually a move to destroy Christianity on Madagascar, and the LMS schools were actually providing her people with a decent education. So, why the crackdown? Well, just as the LMS began to panic that their schools would be closed down officially, and they themselves chased off the island, the Queen had a change of heart, reversing her policies and allowing the schools to function normally. This change of heart did coincide with the replenishment of her armed forces, but I'm sure these two things are completely coincidental. Ironically, after this period of the only times tables you need to know are how many rounds you can effectively fire a minute was over, the number of pupils at the schools increased from 2,500 to 4,000. This also began a period of Ranavalona passing both pro- and anti-Christian legislation. The traditional aristocrats, who were her biggest supporters, obviously wanted the complete eradication of this foreign religion. The LMS and the expats within it obviously providing her with the services she currently needed. This precarious balance of power sat on a knife edge, and that knife edge grew sharper every day. Slowly, whispers began to circle. What would happen once the Queen no longer needed the European settlers or LMS? And it wasn't just the LMS and those currently helping to make essential goods in the factories for Ranavalona. It was the other ethnicities and communities that inhabited the island. As the Queen tightened her grip on power, what would happen to the people who were non-essential to her plan? These questions will be answered in part 2, and whilst it could be argued that the start of this story had similar beats to that of a fairy tale, the next few chapters of Ranavalona's reign were anything but. And on that sombre note, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.